Our story begins with a date, August 2nd, 216 BC. Now, this might not be a date that you recognize, but I guarantee if you were an ancient Roman, you would not only know this date, but it would probably send a shiver down your spine. Why? Because August 2nd, 216 was the worst day in the history of the world's most famous empire. It was a day actually quite near the very beginning of that empire. In the late 3rd century, the city of Rome controlled the Italian peninsula through a web of allies and colonies. It had just won its first major war against one of its much older, more established neighbors, the nation of Carthage. And this war was a proxy war for control of the island of Sicily. We call it the First Punic War. And following this war, the son of the defeated Carthaginian general, a young man named Hannibal, swears a blood oath to dedicate his entire life to destroying the city of Rome and its people. And to do this, he stages one of the most daring invasions in history, crossing the Alps in late autumn 218 with no supply chain, 40,000 men, and yes, war elephants. It's not a phrase I get to say very much, so I'm going to say that again. War elephants. After a series of smaller victories in the north, Hannibal makes his way to a major supply center in the south, near a town called Cannae. Now, faced with the loss of its food supply to its capital, Rome decides to mount an all-out frontal attack and sends the largest army it had ever fielded, 85,000 men, under the personal command of its 2 consuls, its heads of state, to confront Hannibal head-on. On August 2nd, the 2 armies meet. Now, Hannibal, having far fewer men, predicts that what Rome will do will attack him with a frontal aggressive assault and try to win with brute force. And so he executes this daring, brilliant tactic of a slow, controlled retreat from his center that allows his army to encircle the Roman army from all sides and begin cutting it down. The Battle of Cannae was a bloodbath. The historian Polybius tells us that of the 85,000 men that fought for Rome that day, 70,000 died, 10,000 were captured, and as few as 3,000 escaped. August 2nd, 216 should have been the day that Rome ended. It had absolutely no hope to go on. It had lost all of its men. It had lost one of its heads of state and 80 leading senators in the battlefield. It had nothing left but surrender to Hannibal. Rome would have to stay a small regional power with no empire. Now imagine how that changes our world. No Roman Empire means probably no Christianity, no Europe, no modern world as we know it. So why didn't Rome end that day? Well, to answer that question, we turn from war to politics and explore one of the strangest political systems in world history. What, for example, did the ancient Romans have in common with Bitcoin and a starfish? Well, let's begin with talking about what was considered normal for a government to be organized at the time. In the large empire of Persia to the east, we had Cyrus the Great, better than average ruler, as the name suggests, and under him, a series of chief ministers who in turn commanded provincial armies, governors, and courts. Now, this was how politics had been done for 3,000 years, since the very first empires in Mesopotamia. Very clear lines of authority and accountability, all pointing up. Now, this could permit Cyrus to do some very positive, even innovative things. But fresh ideas were slow to circulate in a system like this. Initiative had to come from the top down, and power was given out not by talent or ingenuity, but by loyalty, personal loyalty. The center was indispensable, and the empire could remain stable as long as the center held. The first major departure from that system was classical Greece. Now, classical Greece had no one ruler. It instead had 1,000 independent city-states with two predominant ones, Athens and Sparta. And each of the cities were a little bit different, but they could come together in a crisis to repel an external threat, like Persia. So the system was more diverse and more dynamic, but it also depended on a careful balance between its two most powerful cities, Athens and Sparta. The whole system relied on that balance, and that balance didn't last. So to see how different Rome was, we're going to look at it through the eyes of one of the survivors of the Battle of Cannae, a young and ambitious officer named Publius Cornelius Scipio. Now, Scipio comes from an old and famous family, but he doesn't have any automatic path to political office and no emperor that can promote him. You see, like all Romans, like all young Romans, to get ahead, Scipio has to compete with the most brilliant and best-connected members of his generation to get to every next step in the political ladder, what the Romans called the cursus honorum, or the path of honors. See, Rome was the first system to rely almost entirely on elections to fill its offices. At Athens, the democracy had used lotteries to fill its offices. Well, Rome had elections, and it had a lot of them. And every year, young, ambitious candidates like Scipio would have to win alliances, not only with the most wealthy and rich families to fund their campaigns, but also with the influential shop owners, the farmers, the merchants who could corral votes in the people's assemblies. And Scipio himself would have to go in person to the forum and speak in front of the entire Roman people and persuade them, "My fellow Romans, please vote for me." Sounds familiar. But it's not the democracy as we know it. For one thing, like everywhere in the ancient world, of course, women, slaves, immigrants were excluded from this system. And other things would look strange to us too. See, Rome had no Supreme Court, for example, to interpret its constitution. In fact, it had no written constitution at all. Rome had no police force. Rome had no prison system, no professional bureaucracy. In Scipio's time, Rome didn't even have a standing army. And it was incredible that a city like this could get anything done at all, much less conquer the known world. Well, one of the first observers to try to make sense of the Roman system was this historian I mentioned before, Polybius. Writing 2 generations after Cannae, Polybius is trying to explain to the Greek-speaking world how Rome got so successful. And he says, no, it wasn't just their toughness or their courage or their luck. What made Rome really great was this bizarre, strange constitution. And Polybius was the first to map it. And so Polybius said, look, I know what you're used to is power centralizing, say in a monarchy, it centralizes around an emperor, or in a democracy, all power centralizes around an assembly. Well, Rome, it didn't do that. Rome divided power 100 different ways. And in fact, all of its different officials had influence and could check the power of the other ones. And this, of course, wasn't by design. Rome had no founding fathers, it had no written constitution, but it was a series of adaptations over time, a series of improvisations to manage internal conflicts within Roman society. And these improvised institutions, instead of weakening Rome and dividing it, Polybius says, no, they actually drove all the citizens to push themselves and excel. And instead of weakening the system, they strengthened it. Empires like Persia and Egypt and Babylon, they needed a powerful center. Well, the strangest thing about Rome was that politically, it had no center. You had the Senate, of course, which was a permanent body, but it could only advise the officials. And the officials only had power for 1 year each, and then would rotate back into the Senate. And of course, to get elected, they had to be elected in the people's assemblies, who also had power to ratify or veto their laws. So Polybius, looking at Rome, invents this idea of checks and balances, one of the most important ideas in modern government. But he didn't quite get the whole story. You see, what Polybius missed was the importance of the many individual relationships that someone like Scipio had to build as they moved through the different parts of the political system. See, what Rome really invented was government by network. And this could be very messy. So, for example, in the days leading up to Cannae, as Hannibal is making his single-minded plan to defeat Rome, the two Roman consuls, Varro and Aemilius Paulus, are trading command of the army every single day. But it allowed Rome's network to assimilate new ideas with incredible speed. So in the First Punic War, for example, Rome has no navy. Well, they capture one Carthaginian ship and are able to reverse engineer an entire fleet and are winning battles at sea within 2 years. This is the kind of system Rome was. And as Hannibal found out, this was the kind of system that could absorb a tremendous shock and not only survive, but come back stronger. Well, it took 21 more centuries after Polybius to give this kind of system a name. In the 1960s, a Polish-American immigrant and computer engineer named Paul Baran is doing research at a facility called, and this is true, the Rome Air Force Base in upstate New York in the US. Now, it's the 60s, it's the height of the Cold War, and Baran's task is to design a telecommunications network that could survive in the event of a nuclear attack, which I think you can agree is maybe the one thing more scary than war elephants. So Baran sees how the conventional systems of communication depend on one or on several very expensive, high-frequency transmitters. He said, this is a bad idea. These are going to be the first things that the Russians will attack when they attack us. So instead, he builds what he calls a distributed system of many inexpensive nodes communicating with each other on simple AM radio channels. So there's no center for the Russians to attack. If they attack any part of the system and one little part remains, it could rebuild the whole thing. His paper called On Distributed Networks revolutionizes telecommunications. And so what are these three principles of a distributed network? The first, of course, no center. There's no center to attack. Secondly, there are many different interconnected nodes, and each node is generating information and exchanging information with many other nodes. And finally, any one node has all the information needed to reconstitute the entire system if necessary. Which also is how, incidentally, a starfish thinks. This is how a central nervous system of a starfish works. Which brings us to Bitcoin. You know about Bitcoin, the all-digital currency. Well, people much smarter than me have failed in trying to explain Bitcoin and the blockchain in a small amount of time, but I'm going to give it a try. So the reason why it's important for us is that Bitcoin, all trades, anytime that something's traded, it doesn't go through a central server or a central authority. That Bitcoin works on a distributed system called the blockchain that anyone can add to. It's kind of a ledger or an online database. And it's made safe by a voluntary system of servers called Bitcoin miners that get rewarded for checking constantly the contents of the whole system so that if anyone tries to hack or change one little part, everyone knows about it right away. So this is really useful to build a system of money without a central government, but the idea goes much further than that. We're just starting to explore how the blockchain and distributed ledgers can help us secure our identities online, could help us collaborate and make contracts with each other, and could even help us vote. So, a system with no center, with many interconnected nodes, and each node or each part has the power to rebuild the whole system. Am I trying to tell you that the ancient Romans invented Bitcoin? No. But if we think about these three networks that Baran talked about, centralized, decentralized, and distributed, we can learn a lot about politics and political system, both in the ancient world and right now. So Persia, of course, is the classical centralized system. It has very clear lines of authority, and it depends on one very strong ruler at the top. It can control a large amount of territory and create a stable rule of law, but ideas very rarely make it from the bottom up. And if the leader dies or makes a big mistake, the whole system can get taken over or fall apart. Ancient Greece is a classical decentralized system. So it's more than one center of power, but of course it still depends on its power centers all interacting in a stable way. Well, what happened to classical Greece, of course, is that its two main cities, Athens and Sparta, finally turned on each other and declared a 30-year total war that ended up leveling Greece to the ground, a war that arguably Greece still has a hard time recovering from. And Rome, however, Rome is a classic distributed system. This is my argument. Rome as a distributed system is not only robust, but it's what the economist Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls anti-fragile. That is, a system that not only can resist harm, but that responds positively to being harmed. And that's exactly what happens after the Battle of Cannae. Scipio escapes back to Rome. The Roman Senate refuses to surrender and gets busy rebuilding the army. It puts teenagers and old men into uniform. It promises any slave that fights for Rome, we will free you. Scipio starts drilling all of his new soldiers in all new techniques from his own ingenuity or from his experience in battle. He invades North Africa, and integrating all of Hannibal's best tactics and techniques, he defeats Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, effectively winning the Punic War for Rome. Over the next century, Rome goes on a tear through the Mediterranean world. But because it's Rome, it doesn't just win territory. It integrates ideas like aqueducts, roads, city planning, medicine, poetry, philosophy. This society that talks about itself as based on tradition and toughness actually is taking the best ideas from the entire world and bringing them in and making it better. Rome's distributed network literally reinvents its world. So could it be that we are on the edge of a similar moment now? Look around. We see central governments, nation states, the UN, under stress or failing. Is it possible that distributed systems are just now starting to prove that they can replace those older ones? Well, Wikipedia has already replaced older encyclopedias as a distributed repository of knowledge. And some governments are already starting to use the blockchain with startups like Factum to safeguard critical information like birth and land records, and so they don't rely on a central government to keep them safe. And we're even starting to make political decision-making more distributed. At a time when 1 million people move to cities every week, networks of cities like C40 are outpacing traditional governments in the fight against climate change. 3,000 cities already are sharing power and information with their citizens through participatory budgeting, including Paris. And companies like D21, who I work for, are using innovative algorithms to make voting smarter and easier. So because techies and classicists don't always talk to each other, I'm going to finish by giving 3 lessons from ancient Rome for us today. Number 1, inequality. Now, Rome was never a perfectly distributed system, and in the end, inequality is what becomes its biggest problem. It simply got too rich too fast. It was the victim of its own success. By the late 2nd century, there's no one left to challenge Rome, and so Rome's internal divisions between rich and poor, which had always been a problem, now grow out of control. Poor farmers are moved off their land, they're replaced by conquered slaves. The rich political class gets much richer and much less willing to share. And when 2 of Scipio's grandsons, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, propose a major land reform, well, this constitution that had always innovated and added to itself finally breaks. The Gracchi are killed by a mob led by a conservative senator, Scipio Nasica, also their first cousin. So, as we think about distributed systems in our time, it's not only about how the network operates, but about who is included and excluded from that network. The blockchain can help us build better birth and land records, but ensuring equal access to those systems is something that technology or the blockchain won't solve alone. Second, the problem of physical force. After the death of the Gracchi brothers, Rome is still unconquerable on the battlefield, it descends into 100 years of civil war. And poor Romans who have no land and no jobs sign up with powerful generals like Pompey and Caesar, who, instead of fighting for the entire state, are now fighting for their own power. And instead of settling their rivalries in the forum, they're now settling them on the battlefield, or in the case of Julius Caesar, in history's most famous assassination. For us, architects of distributed networks must always keep in mind all the different ways how the threat of force can overturn even the best ideas, whether it's the 51% attack that hackers could use to undermine the blockchain, or the way that networks like ISIS use distributed social media to attract new members. Finally, innovation. So innovation, we know how important it is, but keep in mind that Rome kept its empire while losing its distributed republic. The same kind of innovation that had added to the Constitution and kept Rome free and fighting for the common good, in the end, innovation became a struggle to be the last man standing. That man, the young Caesar Augustus, was maybe the most innovative politician who ever lived. But his innovations are not innovations that we necessarily would like. He centralized power on himself. He canceled the elections, and he reconsolidated an empire that, yes, the Roman Empire ruled for another couple centuries, but this centralized system, this new Rome, finally collapsed under the weight of weak leadership and suffocating bureaucracy. Weak leaders, suffocating bureaucracies. Does this sound familiar? So, yes, we recognize that the systems, the big power systems of the last century, are just no longer serving humanity, much less saving it. The distributed network helped Rome invent the world as we know it. In this century, let's use the secrets of the Roman Republic to build a human republic that can reinvent that world. Thank you.